the website of Richard's program initiative. He received his PhD in comparative literature from Washington University in St. Louis. His doctoral research focused on issues of gender, sexuality, and race in plantation literature of the American South, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. His research concentrates on gender and minority representation in literature and film of the American South, the Latinx diaspora, and Latin America. In addition to publishing on pedagogical approaches to sexuality, migration, and service learning, current projects include interviews with immigrants deported from the United States to Mexico and their struggles to adapt. He recently published a queer romance, Queering the National Romance, Latinx Narratives of Belonging from the Squatter and the Don to Red, White, and Royal Blue, and that is in our recent PIAS journal. Thank you, Richard, for your contribution. He also has a forthcoming article in an anthology of queer theory from Mexico on the LGBTQ movement in Santa Clara, Cuba, as a model for intersectionality in the face of crisis. He has taught courses and given lectures on Latinx and queerness at Iberto Puebla, Mexico, and University of Warsaw American Studies Center in Poland, known as also Ośrodek Studiów Amerykanistycznych. And there was also another professor from this center during our discussion. So warm greetings to her and as well. And we have actually started our collaboration by accident, I have to admit, and I'm really, really happy, sorry, that such accidents do happen. And ever since we met in the spring of 2024, we have been talking about doing various things together, which actually resulted in the aforementioned publication that Richard contributed with to the PIAS journal. But we also did a panel together at the recent Frontiers and Wasteland conference in Spain, in Alcalá de Henares. We are looking forward to our further collaboration, to cooperation, to our future projects, and keep your fingers crossed, because we are right in the middle of preparing one right now. It's like an Erasmus Plus, but for the states that are outside of the European Union. So hopefully this will work out. Okay, Richards, the floor is yours. I leave it to you. We have already, let me say, 32 people. Okay, so you will see whether the project, the immigration project, will work out or not. It all depends on you. The floor is yours, and I'm really, really grateful that you came over here online virtually, and that you agreed to give this talk to us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I do wear a lot of hats, as many of us do in academia. So, and I'm also grateful for these accidents of life that we met fortuitously, but completely by accident, and have been able to collaborate so wonderfully so far. And I look forward to many more collaborative endeavors. So thank you for that. I'm going to do, I think what I'm going to do is a rapid review of who I am, and because it informs everything that comes later. I'm not going to talk about all the slides, but I will share the slides with your professor, who can then share them with those who are in attendance if they want more details from the slides. Yeah. Because there's a lot of details in there that we don't have time for, and I'd rather try to do an interactive engagement activity as well. So here we go. Yeah. Since we're in the holiday season, I'm starting off with these images of the Virgin Mary. The particular version of the Virgin Mary, La Guadalupana, the patron saint of immigrants in Latin America. You see on the left hand the Virgin Mary, Joseph, and Jesus as redefined as immigrants today. And the smaller image is VG for Virgin of Guadalupe, got her green card. And so you can see the interplay of a lot of these things, and we're going to come back to some similar images in a little bit. But since her feast day was just 2 weeks ago, I thought we could start off with that and sort of contextualize that. Yeah. So I'm going to start with some immigration stories and maps and Latin and images. So I'm a third generation American. My great grandparents immigrated over, and up until my grandmother, they still spoke Dutch. They immigrated for financial and religious reasons. Unfortunately, they're very conservative and reactionary to current immigrant realities. So I'm an outlier in my family. My parents were internal immigrants. They immigrated from Michigan to LA and then returned later. Um, my first exposure to immigrants of from Latin America was at the age of 14 in 1981. You can guess then how old I am. Uh, and I was picking blueberries, which I for a long time hated the taste of blueberries after that experience because it's a very onerous, labor-intensive job that I could quit because, as a person who didn't depend on that labor, I was able to quit when it got too much. But of course, the people I worked with couldn't. But that sort of raised my consciousness. Flash forward to my first years in graduate school where I wasn't sure I was going to do grad school. And I worked coordinating GED classes, and GED are like high school equivalency classes, and ESL, so English language classes, and DL driver's license classes for on the farm. So we would drive out to the farms where migrants were working and teach them classes at night by usually by firelight or candlelight after they had worked, a 12, 13, 14-hour day. Um, this was not all farms allowed us to do that, and this was a program that the state funded at one point. It doesn't fund it anymore. So that they could, you know, make a life for themselves beyond just migrant labor. The driver's license thing is really important because many migrants are historically um, not necessarily arrested by ICE, but they're arrested by local police first and then turned over to ICE. And most of the time, it's from a traffic violation. And so, and they don't have a driver's license. So New York State recently, like 2 years ago, passed a green light law, which allows irregularly documented people to have a driver's license, a state issued driver's license. This allows them to avoid detection from less than friendly rural police departments for traffic infractions, and then it avoids them being turned over to ICE because local police can't check that, but they'll check if you don't have a driver's license, and that starts the process. So if people get a driver's license, they're often able to then avoid being turned over to ICE. So that was an important thing that I worked on. Um, then on a personal level, while I've been married twice, once to a Cuban immigrant and currently to an Italian immigrant. These are both immigrant groups with privilege, so their experiences are really quite different. And I'll talk about that some more later. Um, my hometown was founded by Dutch immigrants. It's now very Mexican in nature, and not everybody has been happy with that transformation. Yeah. I also now live in another border city, and I'll talk about that in a moment, why that's important. Um, and I also did some work at the southern border because Buffalo was in the northern border. We're right across the river from Canada. It's a 20-minute drive. But I also worked in Arizona, in the southern border with a Jesuit institution. And that, when you go there, and you can volunteer there, anybody can volunteer there. It's helpful if you know Spanish. Um, they challenge you with, okay, well, now that you've done this, what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to affect change in the system? And so that's what I inspired me to establish the Borders and Migrations Initiative, and then to change my teaching. It completely changed a lot of what I teach, and so now I teach immigration in Spanish, but also in English through film, through literature, songs, artworks, geocaching projects, immigrant interviews and for interviews with advocates, writers, filmmakers, archivists, and we do service learning. We also have a study abroad slash internship slash immersion service learning program with Kino Border Initiative in the South. We also have projects with partners in Mexico along the immigration routes and now hopefully in Europe. Um, and the other advocacy work I do is in the classroom and outside of the classroom because most people in Buffalo don't understand what it means to be a border city and don't understand how much we have an ICE presence in our city. And so part of my agenda is to just educate our local population. And I should say that although New York State is liberal and Democratic voting, that's primarily in the cities, and you don't have to go very far outside of Buffalo, which is a smallish city, though the second largest in New York. But to find very conservative anti-immigrant sentiments. So kind of raising the awareness of that. Yeah. And there's been a lot of protests in Buffalo against this, even though the immigrant community in Buffalo has also been the source of its post-industrial resurgence. Yeah. So that's just some context. Yeah. So as I said, it was a story about maps. The very long, skinny, upright arrow shows where my great-grandparents immigrated to. They immigrated to Detroit. They did not go through Ellis Island. They went through Detroit, which was a port of entry. Grand Rapids is the city near to where I grew up, which is now very much a Mexican city. LA is where I was born, and then Dos Nogales is where we have our program at the southern border. Dos Nogales is literally a city on the border divided by a wall that goes down the middle of the street. And then B for Buffalo, which is where I currently live. These maps, so this is my great-grandparents' immigration papers, which I discovered after my parents' death. You'll notice that there's a lot of people on that form. Today, these people would not be allowed into the country under the current circumstances under which they immigrated. Yeah. They spoke no English and they had no skills. Only the father and one of the older sons had a skill, and that skill was house painter, which is not exactly a prime need immigration justification. But because of where they came from and their race, they were admitted without any issues. And this was the entirety of their application process. I bring this up because most Americans ask, well, why don't they come the way my grandparents came? Well, because your grandparents came and it was basically you got on a boat and you came over. Yeah. And nowadays the system is much more complicated. So part of what I want to do is point out to people how you can't compare past immigrations to today's immigration. Yeah. Also, I meant to add this at the beginning. If anyone has questions or wants a clarification, I think there's a raise your hand option or something, and we can go from there. Yeah.
We can also
So
put them
this
in the chat if
or
someone
in the
wants to
chat
put.
also.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
gonna be probably
And it's
better.
okay to interrupt me. It's fine. So this is images from what my hometown used to look like. Yeah, very centered on its Dutch heritage. They still have this festival. I used to dress up like that for Halloween when I was a child. I still have that costume. My son wore it as well. So, very much identified with a past that doesn't obviously exist anymore, nor does it exist in Holland anymore. But this is sort of where I grew up in. However, this is what my hometown looks like now, where there's a lot of Mexican influence. And you see on the far right, these are the um, worshipers who are doing a parade in honor of the Virgin Mary, of Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe, the image I showed you at the beginning of my talk, dressed in indigenous Aztec style costumery, celebrating her appearance to the indigenous Juan Diego. Yeah. And it's snowing because, of course, it's Michigan. It's the same sort of latitude as Warsaw and Poland is. And so you have, yeah, this transplanted reality. But inside the church, you've got the desert background just to remind people where they came from and where they are now. And of course, the priest wearing the emblem of the Virgen de Guadalupe. Yeah. And so this is how my hometown has transformed. And you've seen these transformations throughout the Northwest. Chicago also is a very big center of this kind of activity. Yeah. And so here's another map. I told you it was going to be a story about maps, and here you see Buffalo right on the border with Canada. But you'll notice all of the cities in the United States, most of the cities in the United States are coastal cities or border cities, and they fall within the 100-mile border enforcement zone. So most of my life, I have actually lived in border enforcement zones, including when I lived in Virginia. And that border zone basically is an extra constitutional zone, which means that even though I am a citizen by birthright of the United States, the Constitution is superseded by ICE necessities. So, ICE, for example, could potentially raid my home without a warrant because ICE operates extrajudicially and outside of constitutional limitations. So, and most people don't know that. Yeah. And so ICE has authority above and beyond what the Constitution normally protects citizens from because they're after quote unquote non-citizens, and non-citizens do not have constitutional rights. And one can see throughout the city of Buffalo, ICE trucks, ICE's Immigration Customs Enforcement. They have offices here downtown. There's a prison downtown. There's also a prison about 45 minutes outside of the city, and other offices related to that. And most Americans have no clue about this. I mean, you see that most of the U.S. population actually lives within this 100-mile enforcement zone, which is deeply problematic. Not all states are cooperative in terms of ICE jurisdiction. New York is not cooperative, for example, in terms of like coordinating between police activity and ICE activities, but that varies also by county. And many of the counties are rural, and the sheriffs sometimes um, don't enforce state laws and enforce local laws of collaboration. Yeah. So that's just something to bear in mind. Yeah. Another map, and I bring this up because to talk about the route, and the route that I have historically worked on is this route that ends up sort of in this. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the right-hand side of the red line that goes up through California, but it starts off in what today would be Dos Nogales and towards Phoenix and Tucson. Yeah. And this was started in 1775, the year, or 1776, the year that the United States gained independence from Great Britain. And these were settlement routes that first under the Spanish and then under the Mexicans. And it's the routes that people still travel. And the question is, well, why? Well, now there's roads there. But these routes also followed riverbeds, yeah, and so that's the origin of many of these routes, yeah. So this settlement route, it was primarily through the mission system, and one of the people that founded the mission systems was, of course, Father Kino, who's a Jesuit, originally from Italy, who, after whom the border initiative that I collaborate with is named, yeah. And you can see some of the missions, one of which is still working on the To'ono O'odham reservation. The other one, Tucumacori, is not used anymore. And you see the same route. Yeah. And as I have to remind my American students, the United States has had a history of expansion westward that we tend to forget about. And that includes the annexation of Mexico, of what is now primarily Texas, but also all of California, Nevada, Colorado, in New Mexico and Arizona, and the automatic granting of citizenship to those people, named after the Treaty of Guadalupe. Then we're back to Guadalupe. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Then we had the Spanish-American War, which I don't want to dwell on, but again, it expanded U.S. territory and incorporated new citizens from Latin America. Um, and by the numbers, so people have always been estimating the Latinx population in the United States. They always get it wrong, and it's always lower than what it actually is. And if the highlight here in yellow is what they predicted, however, the actual numbers were significantly higher than what they predicted. And I bring this up in part because Americans have a tendency to think that the African American population is about 50% of the US population, which is woefully exaggerated. Yeah. And most Americans also think the Latin American population is significantly larger than it is or smaller than it is relative to the African American population. And so Americans' perceptions of immigration and race is really kind of skewed, and that's another important factor to kind of remind people of. The Hispanic population is roughly now around 20%. It's projected to be 25% within the next 5 years. African American population is roughly 13%. Then we have to look at, well, why is all of this happening? Well, we have, of course, U.S. interventionist policies and the number of wars that we have fought in Latin America and other forms of intervention that the United States has engaged in. And this is all throughout Latin America, including through to today. This map does not give you all of the most recent ones. And I would just say that we have a tendency to blame one party over another for this interventionist policies, but as both parties have equally engaged in interventionist policies of economic destabilization, political destabilization, supporting coups in one way or the other. The last coup that the United States supported was actually under the Obama administration in Honduras. Um, and engaging in other forms of destabilization. I will also point out, however, that while the United States is currently distracted in other arenas of global influence, China has been steadily extending its influence in Latin America in other ways. Yeah? Some of these things that we work with are relatively new. The Kino Border Initiative, as I said, named after the Jesuit missionary Father Kino, was established in 2008. They operate on both sides of the border and provide support services for those trying to cross the border. We don't ask whether they are crossing with legal means or extra legal means. We just support them. And for people who have been deported back, one of the most important things they do is to provide a change of clothing, because when you are deported, you are frequently deported in prison uniforms so that you are immediately targeted once you are deported and people know that you've been deported. Yeah. So one of the things to do is to get them not just food and a shelter. They get up to 3 days of shelter. They can get a phone card to make some phone calls. Sometimes transportation is arranged. This also happens here in Buffalo, by the way. Um, but it also allows them to try to blend in, because they may not even be from Mexico once they've been deported. They could be from Guatemala, Honduras, or further south. Yeah, so they don't know anyone in the city, and they are easily targeted by gangs. Yeah, we do cash checking, because when you are released with your belongings, but instead of whatever cash money you had on you, you're given a check. Most of the people don't have bank accounts, so they can't actually cash a U.S. issued government check, right? So they're stuck at the border and they can't do anything. The Mexican government also provides them counselor services, and there also is a psychiatrist online for some basic psychiatric treatment for those who've been traumatized by the process. Yep. Um, and this again is just reminding you of the route. This is the route. It's been that route for hundreds of years, and it's still the route today. Oh, I would also just point out on this map, you see Casa Grande there. I don't know if you are able to see that. There are large prisons now along this same route. So what used to be missions are now places where there are large detention centers, which are mostly private. That means for profit. We'll talk about that in a minute. Also, another organization I work with is Mariposas Sin Fronteras, which is for LGBTQ people in immigration detention and providing them bonds to get out. So sometimes you are imprisoned, and if you fight your deportation, then you are detained, and that detention is in what's the word I'm looking for? Indeterminate, because you're not a citizen, so you don't have right to habeas corpus and so forth. And so you could be, for example, in detention for 9 years, sometimes before a hearing actually happens. And in fact, recently a person was just released after 9 years in detention. Um, and this particular group works with LGBTQ subset of those who are in detention center in Eloy and Florence. These are two very small towns in Arizona their basic industry is for-profit private detention centers, which makes prison sound nicer than just prison, but that is in fact what they are. Yeah. And I've been inside these prisons as well. Then here locally in Buffalo, we have Justice for Migrant Families. There are several organizations in Buffalo that work with asylum and refugees. Those are people who are legally processed through the U.S. system. Justice for Migrant Family works with those who are not legally processed through the system, who have been arrested and detained, whose families have been broken up, and or who have been impacted by detention in a detention center, which is about 45 minutes outside of Buffalo. What they do, they offer pen pal communication, detention visitation. So I send students into the detention center and they visit with these people. It's helpful to know different languages. Most people don't necessarily speak English there. Sending them books, which is a very complicated process, but they don't have anything to read because, again, they're not citizens.
I think it frozen. Okay, let me check that. Good. Okay.
They don't have any of the in-court proceedings. Yeah. It helps if the community members show up to show that there are people there to support them. Phone line support. We have a phone line bank that they can call in for support and a food bank for either themselves or for for their family members who are not detained outside. Yeah. There's another organization called Los Samaritanos, which provides dignity bags. Again, sometimes these people are released from the detention center and they have to walk 2 miles to the nearest gas station in the middle of nowhere along a freeway, and there's nothing for them, right? You're released, you're allowed to be in this country. Good luck. And sometimes they are released with the clothes that they were arrested in. And I would just clarify that just because they're detained in Buffalo does not mean that they were arrested in Buffalo. They were most likely arrested in the South, transported north as a deterrent and as punishment, and then released perhaps with unsuitable clothing for the weather that is customary here in Buffalo in the winter. So now there's an agreement with the gas station that they can make a phone call. They call Samaritanos or Justice for Migrant Families, who will then arrange a backpack that has some basic necessities for them, and usually give them a bus ticket to wherever they need to go as their cases unfold, and a little bit of money. Yeah. This is my organization. It's established in 2018, and as my colleague said, right, there's this website, which you can look here. There's also a YouTube channel, and I have that again in a slide a bit later. Yeah. Here's well, actually it's here, the YouTube channel, which you can see here. And the two figures that you see here, I just want to point out the person with the beard, the sort of Santa-looking cowboy. He's a Jesuit. He's the original founder of the Kino Border Initiative. And the woman next to him is the former archivist for the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. So these have been some of the speakers that we have had invited here. And here's our YouTube channel. I'm not going to go into this, just that the United States has a very complicated immigration history. Again, if you are interested, we can go back to this or you can look at this later. But again, all these histories are complicated. As you see here, the United States has a very complicated relationship to immigration, particularly about race, ethnic, sexual, and religious lines. If you are interested also in a sort of more visual interactive map, this is a dendrochronology map, which is like taking tree rings, but tree rings of immigration, and showing where people have immigrated from and during what time periods. Green represents primarily Europe. Pink represents primarily Asia, and yellow represents primarily Latin America. What is missing in this numerical dendrochronology is the immigration of force by indigenous groups and or by African American groups. And I would just point out that Americans think that the United States has the largest population of African diaspora peoples, which is, of course, is not true. If you look at the bottom, the United States has a very relatively small number of imported slave labor. The Caribbean, including through Brazil and the northern part of South America, have a significantly larger population. This interactive map is something that you can also look at. Yeah. We've also had immigration policies around Chinese Exclusion Act, which was basically about controlling Asian Americans or Asians from, to put it bluntly, reproducing and therefore creating Asian American citizens. Yeah. So only men could immigrate and only for certain numbers of times. And so this is partly an explanation of why the Asian American population in the United States is relatively small in relationship to other immigrant populations. HIV, so sexuality was also a category of exclusion. It's technically not, although it can still be used against you as under the health limitations. Yeah. There's also sexile, which is people who immigrate for reasons other than economic, immigrate for reasons of sexual oppression. And it represents about 1.3 million people in the United States. So the three questions that people ask is, why do they come? What is the impact on the US? And why don't they come legally? And Americans have a really skewed perspective of these answers to these things, as is evident in our political situation as well. Yeah. So the United States thinks we have the largest number of refugees in the world. We don't. We have less than 1% of refugees are resettled into the US. If you look at the map here, the top hosting countries don't even come close to anywhere near the United States. Yeah. So the United States perception of how many refugees we receive as opposed to how many are actually here is completely lopsided. Yeah. Immigrants in the United States, you can see here, FB means foreign born, where they primarily come from, and they come from these countries under different circumstances. We'll talk about that really quickly in just a minute. Why do they come? Obviously, the push and pull factors are primarily economic or political. Poverty, as you can see here. Violence, primarily funded by the United States, which is the largest consumer of drugs, thus supporting the cartels, and which exports an exponential number of weapons into Latin America. So those are some of the primary reasons. Yeah. Economic impact, well, basically the immigrant workers contribute over $2 trillion to the US economy. They help slow the aging of the American society. And even though people say immigrants lower the wage standards, they in fact do not lower the wage standards in the United States, even though that is an argument that many people make. And they pay taxes, including into Social Security, which, by the way, none of them will have access to unless they get legal status. So immigrants without legal status, even though they pay into the system, never have access to that system. So Americans are benefiting from that labor in that way as well. Yeah. People also think about crime. Oh, the immigrants are committing crimes. Again, statistics prove, yeah, that the largest number of crimes are committed by native-born Americans. That in fact, legal or undocumented immigration accounts for the lowest numbers of crimes committed by people in the United States. The jobs they do, Americans can't do, and every time the United States passes laws within different states that are going to crack down on immigrant labor, they move, and then the economy of the local areas collapse because Americans will not do these work, yeah, for the pay that is offered to them. So why don't they come legally? We've sort of addressed this already. There's me with a group of students at the border. And here's the process by which they come. This is one of the trails of detritus, and as you see there. Just a quick little question. Anybody know why there's a black water bottle there in the right-hand side picture? Nobody?
Maybe like the water stinks less. I don't know.
That's a good guess. But that's not quite the reason. But it is related to water, but not for its smell. Any other thoughts?
They can't reflect the water.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you have a clear water bottle at night, the water bottle will be reflective from flashlights and drones. So they paint the water bottles black to hide the migrants because they primarily travel at night to go unseen. Yeah. And then of course there's the abandoned backpacks and so forth, and also cadavers. One also encounters cadavers along this route. Yeah. So I think, Ava, how many people do we have in our group?
34,
34.
but
Okay.
it's counting us as well. So
Okay. And how much time do we have still?
we are supposed to finish at 7:15. 8:45, so we have
Okay, so we have 45 minutes.
more than that. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So what I'd like to do is, if I think you might have to do this, I don't know that I can do it. Can we form like 12 random breakout rooms? And then just assign people randomly. So what I want you to do is I'm gonna go to each breakout room and I'm gonna give you an actual immigrant identities, an actual person, yeah? And I want you to kind of look at their profile and then think about whether or not they would actually have um, a, a legal way to come into the country, right? Just randomly, you can all tell me if you think this person what this person's chances are of crossing the US border legally. Yeah. So here we have an athlete, contracted with the New York Yankees, professional baseball player. Um, any thoughts onto their possibility and processes and expense for getting into the United States? Don't be shy.
That an African athlete?
Um, let's say he's from the Dominican Republic, which is where many of them come from. Any thoughts?
That's like quite a famous one, I think. I've heard of
Yeah,
him.
but it's not really Kobe. That's just the
I
name
would
I
think
gave
you
him.
wouldn't have a problem.
That is correct. In fact, he wouldn't even have to pay any money. It's already paid for him. He just walks in. Yeah, that's an easy one. Yeah. Um, what about Sam? Sam has $1,000. Crossed the U.S.-Mexico border after coming from China, going through 11 different countries, walking with his son. He's from Henan province in China, participated in some protests. His wife and younger son are still in China, and entered through Ecuador, which has a visa-free travel relationship with China. Any thoughts?
Anybody, what do you think?
There's no right or wrong answers because I mean these are real people, and I'll tell you what actually happened to them, but I want to know what you think would have happened to them.
That stereotype of Ecuador being somehow maybe connected to drug trafficking might work against Sam
It
here.
could, except that he's not Ecuadorian, he's Chinese, so that maybe makes a difference. Any other thoughts?
The fact that he's been an activist is kind of is in his favor, but he has a family and a younger son remaining in China, which means, kind of some kind of chain migration, and I don't think that would be appreciated because he has somebody in tow.
That's correct. So, the young man who answered first, Ecuador is slightly problematic, and if he were Ecuadorian, he would not be admitted. But he's actually Chinese, and he was a dissident. Yeah, so the likelihood of him entering would be significantly higher, even though he's got family. Um, because there's an antagonistic relationship with China, we are willing to let that family in. Yeah. So even though it's chain migration, which would be generally frowned upon, it's the country of origin that is his benefit and why he left. Yeah. So he's gonna, and then in fact, Sam actually is currently living in Albany, which is the state capital here of New York. Yeah. Oops, sorry. Louise, who's Cuban, gay, and HIV. He entered Mexico on a Schengen visa. It's complicated, but that is something you can, in fact, do. And crossed the U.S.-Mexican border with a coyote and was handed over, walked along the wall and handed over to U.S. Border and Customs, who loaded him onto a bus, put him into detention, and then released him. He was released with about 3 other Cubans. The rest of the group that was with him, which included people from as far away as Uzbekistan, were immediately deported. So what happened to Louise?
Not much of a chance, I'd say.
Okay, because
Well, he's gay, he's HIV positive.
both of those things are true. But any idea of what might work in his favor?
Also, maybe it's unclear where the money or the capital comes from.
That's possible, but I should clarify here that he is a doctor in Cuba, or I mean that's his background. Not that that makes you rich in Cuba, because it doesn't. But
Yeah.
any other thoughts? So Luis actually is currently in Boston. His case is under appeal. He's been here for 2 years now. Um, he is a friend of mine who showed up on my doorsteps 2 days after I got back from Europe and said, "Hey, remember how you said that if I ever came to the United States, I could stay with you?" So he did not disclose his HIV status when he crossed the border. Um, but because he's Cuban, Cubans immigrate with privilege because it's an antagonistic relationship with the United States. It's not as easy as it used to be. My former wife came over very easily. Um, she was also white, and Louise is black. Um, Obama ended the wet foot, dry foot policy, which was basically if you step foot on U.S. soil, you're good. Yeah. So Louise's case is still pending because he was released under probation and has to justify that, and that is still pending and costing him a huge amount of money. However, because he was released on probation, he is allowed to work in the United States. And so he works and has an apartment, and he's working now in Boston. Yeah. Well, Chloe, she's got paperwork from an employer. She's got some money. She's from France. She's got a PhD in winemaking and decided to try her winemaking skills in California. She gonna be lucky?
She looks like a dream immigrant for the US.
She does, yes, right? Someone who we don't have to pay to educate, but who's going to use her education to our benefit. Yeah, come on over, right? Yeah, she doesn't have any problem. Um, Now, usually when I do this, it's an actual simulation, and each person assumes an individual role. And usually I start asking students, so tell me about wine. What do you like to drink? What's your favorite wine? And if they can't answer those questions, I don't grant them their visa. But technically, Chloe did get her visa and was allowed into the United States. Yeah. What about Karen here? She's from Honduras, but she's coming on a tour, or she's soliciting a tourist visa. She's got enough money. She owns a business. She's got friends in New York she's going to stay with. Any thoughts?
I think it depends if they find out about the working part.
Ah, yeah, all right. Because a tourist visa, you're not allowed to legally work. Yeah. So if she says that, she's not going to get she's not going to get approval, right? And in fact, Karen applied multiple times. Karen has not yet been allowed into the United States. Yeah. Even though she owns property back in Honduras and Guatemala, she's not been allowed in. Yeah. Um, Caramucha, she's fleeing Michoacan because Michoacan, which is a state in southern southern Texas, southern Mexico. Good Lord. Um, and the United States thinks it's Texas. Southern Mexico, um, and is fleeing violence and has been under the assumption that she can apply for asylum. Any thoughts on Carmucha's future?
I think that depends on if she's gonna be able to make clear enough how traumatic and how dangerous her situation is, and then if the United States grant that as sufficient.
Yeah.
So that's okay. That's interesting. And normally that would apply. Yes. Are there other thoughts on what Sabrina said?
And I think she would have to, again, prove that there's this credible danger to her person. If
Mhm.
not, I don't think.
How does one prove that credible danger?
That's right. That's the tricky part.
It's very tricky. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to have all sorts of documentation that you've gone to the police, et cetera, and so forth. Yeah. Um, Also, you have to hope that you speak English well enough, or that the translator provided for you knows Spanish well enough, or whatever language that you're speaking. Most Border Patrol get a 6 weeks crash course in Spanish, which is clearly not enough. Um, None of them, generally speaking, speak other languages, and certainly not any of the multiple hundreds of indigenous languages that are often the first language for many of these people. So, and this is important because the first time you encounter someone at the border, they take a statement from you. You are asked to repeat that story over and over and over and over again. And if any detail varies from the first time you told it to later, you're considered a liar, and that's grounds for deportation. Yeah. And if you're trying to do that in a language that is not your first or even second language, and you're relying on translators who are poorly trained, your story is not going to match up, right? It's never going to match up, and so you're going to be deported. The other thing to note, and this goes to Sabrina's point, many Americans assume that fleeing violence is a right granted you under asylum agreements. The problem is that asylum is when you are a victim of violence based on particular categories, and that violence is perpetrated by state or state-sanctioned agents. If it's just a cartel that's targeting you, that's not a qualifying reality. Yeah. So she could be legitimately targeted by the gangs, but the gang isn't the state. Yeah. And she's targeted because she's poor, but not because she's a member of a religious minority, or because she's a woman, or because she's other minority category that is targeted by the state. Yeah. She's not a dissident. She has no case, really. So unfortunately, she would not be allowed to come in legally. Here we have the married daughter of a U.S. citizen from Mexico. I've given her the name of Yvonne. Her father immigrated, and then under amnesty got to gain U.S. citizenship, and wants to sponsor, his daughter. Notice, however, yeah, that she was married and her husband was abusive, and that is the primary motivation for her to solicit family reunification and to get away from her husband and join her father. Any thoughts on her successful possibilities?
I don't think that the US would be particularly concerned about somebody's domestic issues and any possible violence going on there. Like this doesn't seem to be a protected area for somebody who lives outside the United States.
You are 100% correct on that. Yeah. Even though she's got a US-based father, her motivation is family reunification, but she's also married. That complicates the family reunification issue. And she's trying to reunify with her father to escape her abusive husband. And domestic violence is not a protected category. It's real, and you can feel sorry for them, but it is not a protected category. It was briefly a protected category under Obama. I'll talk about that in a minute. Jeff Sessions, the first Attorney General of Donald Trump, eliminated that. Biden didn't change that. And now, of course, we have Trump 2.0 coming in, so that's not going to change either. So you're correct. An Indian citizen from India, sibling petitioning for family reunification through permanent residency. And he's educated. He's got a tech degree and just wants to contribute to the U.S. economy through his abilities. And he's got a brother here who's here legally. Any thoughts?
Are they going to look into the brother's papers, like, what the story behind his stay in the SS, or not
They
really?
could, but we're going to assume that his brother has legal status,
Okay.
entirely legal status, yeah. So given that background, what are his chances?
I
I
think
have a
the chances.
question.
Mhm.
Yes.
Who offered, the employer or the brother? He offered.
Good question. Yeah. This is not a work-sponsored visa. It's a family reunification visa that is being petitioned. So there's no employer sponsorship here. For the brother, yes, but not for the Rakesh, the applicant. Sorry, that wasn't clear. No. So he does have a legal possibility to do it. It will take between 20 and 30 years for his application to be processed. So he could submit it now, and I would say it would probably be actually closer to 25 to 30 years before it would be actually looked at. Yeah. So at that point, we stop the processing. Yeah. Then we have a street vendor named Gerardo. He's from Guadalajara. They don't have any money. And he just wants to work on a farm, make some money, send some money back to his family. Did not initially get a foreign worker visa status, and so is trying to just find a way into the United States just to work. He doesn't want to be a citizen. He doesn't want to immigrate. He just wants to work.
I feel like a lot hinges on that possible employer, and I don't think that anyone would be particularly concerned in trying to negotiate with the US government for some farmhand worker. I don't think that he has much chances of success.
No, he doesn't. He has no chance at all. Yeah, none whatsoever. He can't even afford the fees that it would take to even apply. Even if he were to have a chance, he doesn't even have the money for that. Yeah. Here is a single mom from Veracruz, which is a city on the Caribbean coast of Mexico. Her case is a bit complicated. Again, these are all real people. She lived in the US for 12 years. She and her husband decided that it would be cheaper for her to raise the kids who are US citizens by birth in Mexico. She went bang. The kids decided that they couldn't adjust to Mexico. They never had been there. They then grew up there. They didn't speak Spanish. They didn't know anybody, so they went back to the United States. And she's trying to get to the US itself. So she's trying to see if she can get legal status through her kids. Her husband is also not a citizen, but her children are. Does she have a case?
If her children are citizens, I think she has a pretty she has strong chance to be allowed in.
So that's true that her children are citizens.
How
Yeah.
old are they?
That's the key. Until they are 21, they are not legally able to sponsor her, and they're minors. So there's no possibility for her to actually legally enter the country, even though her children are legal US citizens. They're underage. They have to be 21 in order to sponsor their mother. So she's stuck. Yeah. So much for family values, right? We can skip this one. His case is the same as Herrera, though he had no chance to enter. Here we have a Ukrainian fleeing war. First went to the town whose name I can never pronounce in Polish. I try and I never get it right, so I'm not going to say it.
Przemyśl. Return.
Thank you.
Przemyśl.
Przemyśl. And then was interviewed and is hoping to come to the United States. Any thoughts? Since that is more your home territory.
I don't know about the US taking particularly many Ukrainian refugees. They would, I think, rather just shove them around Europe, and if they can't stay somewhere else, they would just tell them to go to another European country.
Like Poland, for example. Yeah, that's true. Although they do have a better chance than anyone from Latin America at this point. However, I think that will change significantly under Trump. But you're right. Very few of them are actually getting through. And if we look at the percentages, again, Americans have a perception that we accept lots of refugees and asylum seekers. We accept 1% of the total refugee population. So yes, technically she could come to the United States. It's unlikely that she would, especially because there's children and a husband who is not present, so she would be a financial dependent of the state, and we don't want that. Yeah. The Syrian
if I may go back to that
Yeah.
case, because in my daughter's class, after the war broke out, there were a few Ukrainian kids, and one of them, that was maybe he was with them maybe a month, and they decided to go to Chicago, and from what we know, they did, and they stayed. So, but that was
Mhm.
somehow the whole family.
Yeah, I mean it does happen, and the part of this is privileged because again they're European, and let's be honest, the U.S. immigration system is racially challenged, to be polite about it. I don't know in the case of your daughter, but perhaps also there was some church or family sponsorship within Chicago that helps.
Probably there might have been, yes.
Yeah.
There might have been, but I know that maybe it was also this first phase of the war that just, everybody
earlier
was,
before they thought it was,
early,
yeah.
just right after. So maybe that's how they got it.
Yeah.
But that was
Yeah.
a plan for them all along.
Ah,
So
okay.
Poland was just
Temporary.
temporary, yes.
Yeah.
But not many of those that at least I know. Except for that case, I don't know anybody.
There's very
Of
few. I mean, I
Ukrainian
also don't know
origin would
anybody
go.
here. Yeah. So I don't know how many I don't have the statistics for how many are coming through. But I think it's quite low. Yeah. Then we have the mother from Syria. Again, Syria's reality has significantly changed within the last week. Again, it's unlikely because she would be a burden of the state with children and everything. But it's possible if the UNHCR approves them, they could possibly come. But the numbers of that are also really quite low. Then we have a dreamer. Do we all know what a dreamer is? A dreamer is someone who was brought across the border by their parents when they were underage, and they can apply for dreamer or DACA, this more or less the same thing, status. To stay in the United States, they have to reapply every 2 years. They have to be in good standing. They have to show that they're productive members of society, that they go to college, that they haven't committed any crimes, that they have gainful employment, etc., and so forth. They're generally not allowed to leave the country unless they get special permit to leave the country. So they are sort of in permanent limbo. And here we have Jordy's case here. Who did leave the country and is now trying to come back in.
It will probably take time if it works at all.
Yeah, if it works, and that's a big if, because if he left without prior authorization, he actually
Wow.
violated the terms of his condition. So it's unlikely, particularly with the incoming administration. Yeah. Change of marriage status. I think this is the last one. Change of marriage status. Someone who came on an F1 student visa, and then wanted to change it to a green card, gay, and met an American and married the American. Any thoughts on his possible change of status?
No change. I
No.
would say no change.
I don't know how it is right now. I had a friend when I was in college who actually got married to an American, and she talked about, those visits that the officials would pay to their house at different times of the day, sometimes, in the evening, asking the questions, taking them like to separate rooms and asking about the same event. And if you were not on the same page, that meant that you were either not living together or that you got married because the other person wanted to get a legal status, right, in the United States. So she said that they had several visits like that, and it was really obnoxious. But
Mhm.
since they were married because they wanted to get married, right? So they went through that, even though she said it was really stressful because sometimes, they had like, if you ask me and my husband about a certain event, you would get totally different stories,
Of
right?
course, yeah.
And, she said that it was very, very stressful for them. I don't know whether it changed and whether the question of gay marriage or, heterosexual marriage, couples marriage has anything to do with that. I would say that, Sandra would actually get this status, but
Mhm.
I'm not sure.
So I
Again.
will tell you that that's actually my status with my husband.
Okay.
And
See?
he did get status. Um, And as I said, I think at the beginning, it's a privileged immigration status because, but we had to go through. It was a 3-year long process. Americans think it's automatic. Let me just paraphrase or say that Americans think it's automatic. You get married, good, you're great, you're a citizen. No, you're not. It takes thousands of dollars. You have to have health exams. You have to prove that you're not. I had to prove that I could support him whether or not he was employed, so he wouldn't be a burden to the state. Um, we had to be interviewed to verify that we, in fact, were married for legitimate reasons and not for financial gain. As you mentioned, we had to show that we had accounts, bank accounts, bills in common, that we had a lease together, that we had an actual marriage and so forth. So it was quite a complicated process, but relatively easy to that of many others. I will also say that it it went as well for us because we did have a friend who was an immigration lawyer who helped to make sure everything was true and that all the documentation possible. Our interviews were very short, to be honest, because we had enough proof of the legitimacy of it. But yeah. So anyway, here's some of the outcomes. Yeah. Um, I'm going to stop share for just a second. So I do this activity because most Americans think everybody can come in, and fact, they can't. I think, as a group, did better than my American students about the possibilities of these people's ability to enter. I'll just say one other thing. In the United States, even though gay marriage was legal in some states, including the state of New York, individual states don't control immigration status. That's a federal issue. And so we had to wait until the Supreme Court made it a federal recognition before we could actually apply for his citizenship. And the thing that irks my husband the most is that his citizenship papers are signed by Donald Trump. Oh, the ironies of life. All right. So I'm sorry, wrong PowerPoint. Let's see. Are you seeing this one again with the border fence?
Yes.
So, um, There's a bunch of slides here. I'm not going to dwell on them, but I will send this information to your professor and she can share it with you if you are interested in the specific statistics. So I'm going to run through them rather quickly. If you do have questions, you can raise your hand or put it in chat and we can address it, okay? Because I want to get to some Q&A as well. So, basics of U.S. immigration law is very complicated, and I'm only going to touch on a few things, but it's divided between USCIS, which is U.S. Customs and Immigration Services, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, which was established under George W. Bush, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Yeah. You can have three types of immigration: family-based, reunification, employer-based, and refugee and asylum. Those are the three main cases. Family-based used to be much easier, and it could be anybody who had a relative, like like if you had an uncle could sponsor you. That cannot happen anymore. Yeah, it has to be immediate family members only. Okay. It's a broken system, very obviously, but it's broken because it does benefit certain groups of people, and I would say it's beneficial financially, and that's why it's broken. Most of our immigration detention centers are actually not run by the federal government. They're run by private entities providing cheap labor, and taxpayers pay the bill for housing and feeding and clothing these people, and it doesn't. So the cost is hidden and the profits are also hidden. Yeah. Again, here's how you can do this. And going back to the earlier case, a kid can't sponsor a parent until they're 21 years old. And processing time can take up to 30 years. And if your status has changed in the meantime, let's say you got married or had children while you were waiting those 30 years, you have to refile those petitions. Employment basis, pretty much if you're smart and or have money and or are really good at sports, or apparently if you're pretty, that's how Melania Trump got to the United States, we'll let you in. Yeah. Otherwise, we don't want you, we say. Family-based, you'll note, for example, that in some cases, particularly from Mexico, we are only now processing cases that were filed in 1998. That's a long time. And I mean, what do you do with that, right? But this is on purpose. Yeah?
We have a friend, Ana, remember? Ana Elisa, who actually is from Mexico, who was brought up in the United States, and she was talking about this line, right? How long she's been waiting, and something changed in her status, and then she had to go back to the beginning of a line. So she got so frustrated. She's in Germany right now, and she went for a while to Mexico, but then she did not feel right there either, so she had to look for a different place. But she was talking about that, how she was pushed back. Yeah, and it's years and years of waiting. It's very frustrating.
It's very, very difficult, very difficult. And again, here's just an example of the process that it takes. Here's the different categories. Again, I don't have time to get into the details of this, but you can again look at this later once I send the slide out. You'll notice here different countries have different wait times, as is evidence here for the different kinds of visas. And you'll notice how long it takes some of them to process. Mexico is 24 years behind, or sorry, 26 years behind schedule right now. These numbers are a tiny bit old. COVID exacerbated them by add another 4 years. And under the Trump administration coming in, I would add even more years to that. Let's see. These are our work-sponsored visas. They're capped, and there's government certified organizations that will recruit temporary workers into the United States. For as much as Trump talks about wanting to hire only American, most of his workers at almost all of his properties are actually H1 or H2A or H2B temporary worker holders, because we can pay them less. Asylum seekers, this goes to an earlier point. If you look at red, you notice the numbers plummeted after Matter AB. Matter AB was when Attorney General Jeff Sessions, the first Attorney General under President Trump, decided that domestic violence and gang violence were not protected categories. And so they overturned that, and the numbers then dropped. How can this be? Isn't the judiciary separate from the executive branch? Ha ha ha, it's not. So I'm going to skip over some of this because we've talked about this. DACA, by the way, is on hold. You can't accept new applications anymore. ICE detention centers are deplorable realities. I've been inside them. They're awful. So one of the things that could make a difference is if people had legal counsel. And I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next couple minutes. But they don't, right? So in the United States, anybody has a right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, it will be paid for you by the state. That's only if you're a citizen. Immigrants, detained immigrants without legal status don't have that right because they're not citizens. They don't have the constitutional right. Some states will provide them with attorneys. If you are provided an attorney, you are more likely to win your case. However, it's important to note that although immigration is a court, it is not part of the judicial branch, it's part of the executive branch. So each time there's a new administration, they change how the laws are applied. So even though it functions as a judiciary, it does not function under the judicial system, it functions under the Department of Justice, which is run by the executive branch. Yeah. And so there are no really discretionary laws. There are just the enforcement of laws, but not discretionary decision making. So judicial review, the right to counsel is never a fair fight. And so there are some organizations that try to raise money to satisfy this. The state of New York. Oh, here you can see the outcomes. If you have a lawyer, your outcomes are significantly improved. Again, another table explaining that. In the state of New York, they implemented a program to provide legal counsel. In 2018, it was 4 million part of the budget. It's now about 10 million part of the budget, which people think is a lot of money. And so when voting time comes, people are like, why are we paying to provide counsel to immigrants? They're a bunch of illegal criminals, just deport them. But it, in fact, is such a small fraction of the actual state budget, and you can't even see it on here, but it's within this, where is it here? It's under this 4% budget. It is a percent, like a 0.01% of the 4% budget within this little gray pie chart here. So it's not a lot of money, but it's a political football that makes it think it's a lot of money. But you can see how that has impacted, and its impact on the budget, again, is minimal. So again, this is sort of just a really quick summary. Title 42, again, this was used by Trump to prohibit people from coming in. It's a law that was meant to control cholera, actually. He used it for COVID. Biden did not change it really, and that is still currently in effect in some places. However, it's important to note that this only impacted if you were a land crossing. If you arrived on a boat or if you arrived on an airplane, you were not affected by Title 42, because apparently if you have enough money to fly or boat into the United States, COVID doesn't make you sick. Yeah. So historically, unauthorized immigrants and visa overstays was the largest category of people. And you can see here, people who legally entered, that's the green line, who legally entered and overstayed their visa are actually as illegal as people who have crossed the border without proper paperwork. The number of people who legally entered and overstayed their visa exceeds the number of people who illegally crossed the border. It's important to note that up until recently, the majority of those people who were technically illegal were from Europe or from Canada. That number has since changed. It's now primarily Africans who have been coming over under scam processes through university visa systems, which is a whole complicated matter that my university itself also got snagged up in. They would have they would get visas to come over as students under false pretenses and then disappear. But historically, that number exceeds the numbers of people crossing the northern or southern border. People die along the border. Here in New York, people die primarily in the winter. In the southern border, you can see here, these are toe tags representing people whose remains have been discovered. That's only people whose remains have been discovered. Plenty of people's remains are not discovered. This is an art exhibit that actually I have a copy of, or have it at Canisius. We just have to find a place to put it up. So how about a border wall? Border walls impact animal migration. They also cause flooding because the border is problematic in that way. So there's environmental damage. It's extremely costly. Estimates are between 20, between $6.5 to $20 million per mile to build a border wall, and then to maintain the border wall, and then to staff the border wall with all the electronic surveillance. It is a nearly 2,000-mile long border wall. There is no possible way to actually do this. Deportation, which is what Trump is currently proposing, will cost upwards of $88 billion, just the act of the deportation itself. That does not count the economic impact on the U.S. economy once those cheap labor has been deported. And the U.S. economy depends on abusive labor practices for us to maintain the lifestyle to which we have grown accustomed. And Americans are in for a huge, problematic, and painful awakening once we deport that labor and the cost of things go up. Protectionist economies are usually inflationary, and we are not prepared for this. There's also no political will to solve the issue because it's politically advantageous for both the Democrats and the Republicans to keep this unsolved and to propose legislation that won't go anywhere. We will see what happens under Trump, but his solutions are not going to be favorable overall and over the long term. The whole process itself is profitable to certain entities on both sides of the border, but it ends up costing the U.S. taxpayer. And of course, as other leaders in Canada and Mexico have pointed out, it's not just people crossing the border as well as goods. It is also, in fact, guns and drugs. The United States is the largest exporter of those weapons into Mexico primarily, but also into Canada. And we are the largest importer of those drugs. So it's much more complicated than our politicians like to make it out. I would suggest that, although I am no fan of George W. Bush, he actually did have a plan prior to 9/11, which was to invest in Latin America and create opportunities there so that people were less inclined to immigrate. Yeah. And we're back to the Virgen de Guadalupe and Trump's current plan, which is to deport families, because he argues that he doesn't want to split families, which he was criticized for doing last time around. So we'll just deport everybody, regardless of whether they are citizens. And then if we get rid of birthright citizenship, it doesn't matter anymore, right? So that's his thing. And there's the Virgin of Guadalupe thinking, well, great, I'm going to be deported, as is my son. If you have other questions, here are some websites for you to look at. And I will, again, send this PowerPoint so that you can look at those in more detail, and I would like to have an opportunity for some questions. Let's see, one question was, extra constitutional jurisdiction, which in brief means that ICE has the power to do things that normally the Constitution would prohibit them from doing. For example, search without warrants. So they could technically enter my home without a warrant, even though as a citizen, that is normally my protected right. They could do that. They don't have to justify it either because there's no reporting processes for justification. Detention without habeas corpus, so with unlimited detention without a right to know what you're being accused of and access to an attorney. So those are just kind of two of the biggest examples of what this means. But it means that even as a citizen, my rights are suspended should ICE intervene in that process, which is, to be honest, why things were a little tense with when my friend Luis, the Cuban guy I mentioned earlier, who came over and came to my house. Even though he was allowed to be here legally because he was released on parole, it did create a bit of stress. Yeah, because I'm also married to someone who's also an immigrant, right? Who's a naturalized citizen. So, and that could potentially also be jeopardized. Yeah. So there's that. And I will copy down this email address and can send it to you. Sorry, I just got a message that was that ding. Sorry about that.
I'll send it over. I send it over to Sabrina once I have a, yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
great.
don't
Thank
worry.
you.
Yeah. Any other
Thank
questions?
you.
So
Well,
any
no.
questions?
First of all, thank you very much for a great talk and for the workshop. So, thanks a lot. I think we've learned more, and our students learned more than, throughout the whole course and all our classes. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It was really, really great. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry, I was a little bit fast and there's so much to talk about and it wasn't
I
entirely
know.
sure where to go. And then I was a little frustrated that my little breakout thing didn't work, but I think it came together all right.
Yeah, but it went really well. So we still have 5 minutes. We may even have a little bit more than that. If someone has any questions or comments, please do. I know what you can do, as Miłosz already did, right? Justyna also mentioned something. We also had Piotr Fries talking. So, if anyone has anything that you want to clarify on or that you want to ask, you have an expert here. So take advantage of that, okay? Take advantage of his knowledge and actually ask the question that you want to, have an answer to.
And I hope you feel like I'm a friendly person. So, Sabrina, yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this informative talk, and thank you also that I'm allowed to be here. That was a little bit last minute just passed on, so thank you very much. That was really informative and very helpful. I was just wondering, because that's kind of part of the research that I'm doing at the moment, if you could maybe comment a little bit on the situation of unaccompanied minors at the border, because I'm doing this analysis of Valeria Luiselli's Lost Children Archive, and I kind of encountered this adultification of unaccompanied minors. So this view that they are, on the one side, thought of as capable of crossing the border on their own, and everything that entails, also just fleeing in general, and the traumatic travels that they have to endure in general. But on the other side, they're not granted the same rights than adults, right? And they're still very dependent on people who then take over for them, and there's not really any other chance. And I was just wondering if you could maybe, just comment on that a little bit, if you have any experience with that.
Well, first of all, I want to encourage everyone to read Luiselli. I was very fortunate. She came to Buffalo. She gave a talk, and I was able to meet her and have her actually sign a couple of the books. Yeah, so I think the U.S. government doesn't actually know what to do with them. Yeah. And it's partly because we have also created unaccompanied minors by separating family separation. Yeah. So Trump is currently saying, well, instead of doing family separation, let's just deport everybody. Yeah. Which is not the same thing, because the children are actually U.S. citizens, right? But then they become under separation policies, right? We're going to deport the parents. They still end up being unaccompanied minors. Yeah. Another book that I would recommend is it must be in my other office. Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, The Undocumented Americans. And she explores this reality and how people navigate a system in which they don't exist. Yeah. And actually, the panel that Eva and I did 3 weeks ago, I talked about a graphic novel, or two graphic novels that actually deal with unaccompanied minors. The author is Julio Anta. One of them is called Home, and the other one is called Frontera. And again, I can send you this information if you want. So the rhetoric is contradictory, as you say. Like, on one hand, they're dangerous, they're animals, they're criminals, right? And on the other hand, they're children, and we don't know what to do with them, and we're ill-equipped to actually house and imprison and shelter. And in fact, we've lost many of them, right? We haven't been able to trace them. You know, and it would be one thing to say, well, it's just because we don't have a history of doing this. In fact, we do have a history of doing this, right? We all the way back to the slave era, right? We have a history of treating children as both capable and as incapable, yeah, as both able to have adult consequences and responsibilities, and also to be children, yeah. And that's advantageous because we don't have to treat them as actual people, yeah. And the other thing is that because they're not citizens, they actually don't have any rights. I guess it just in the end comes down to that. They have no rights, yeah. And while people who work within the system are, I think they are themselves dehumanized so that they don't even see them as children. Yeah, I think that's the point. As much as we have dehumanized them, we being the United States, as much as the United States has dehumanized immigrants and immigrant children, unaccompanied minors, we are also dehumanized by that same process, which if we think about Hegel and the master-slave dichotomy, it's very similar, right? And that our own dehumanization allows us to not treat them as actually children. And to expect them, to expect a 3-year-old tell me where you're from and why you left and what date you left. And like they can't answer these things, but yet we keep asking them, right? Because we're asking adult questions for an adult system to a child. The system is designed for adults, yeah. And I don't have a good answer for this. Sorry, Sabrina, I don't have a good answer. But I myself have not worked with children except at the southern border where but they were never unaccompanied. They were always with a mother. I never encountered unaccompanied. But that's also by design to keep most people away from seeing it, right? Because as desensitized and as dehumanized as the people within the system are, actually seeing children in cages, which is real. I mean, that's real, yeah. Most Americans would still have enough empathy for them as children, but we don't want that, right? We don't want the American public to have empathy. We want to hate them. We want to say they eat dogs and pets, right? We want them to be labeled as less than human. And so, in fact, most Americans don't actually see children in literal cages because that would create too much empathy, which would defeat the purpose of it, right? Does that answer it a little bit?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. I know it was a very broad question as well, but I just thought, since I found everything very insightful, to have this inside perspective would have been. So thank you very much for your answer. Yeah, that helps quite a bit.
Yeah, and all my interviews too are with adult deportees, not with children. And I guess I also feel a little ethically complicated about that, you know, with the children, you know. So
if I may just add, if you like, you can email me and I will have to dig it out because I don't know. I remember it was in Spain, so it was one of a conference, but it wasn't the HISPA conference. There was a legal counselor, a person who did it, like, you know, from a nonprofit organization who represented minors. And I remember her saying that because this was very, very powerful, that when she said that her youngest customer, right, that she represented in the court was 6 months old without a parent, right? And then everybody was stunned, you know, and having children, right? You sort of try to figure out how can someone even bring such a baby, right, to through the border, etc. And how can someone bring such a baby to court, right? So I'll try to find out, because I have a name of that person, because I was doing, I was taking notes during this conference. So if you want to get connected with her, and she was very responsive as well. So you may also talk about it or email her about that, but I would have to find it out somewhere, in this space. Okay.
Thank you very much. Could you
No.
just probably also send your email address, because I'm
Sure, I'll
again
type it.
not-
Yeah, I'll put
Thank
it
you.
in the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else?
I would just, while people are thinking about of another question, I would just sort of follow up with what Eva said, that Americans are always like saying things like, I would do anything for my children. I would kill for my children. I would do this and that for my children. Well, that's what these people are also doing, right? They're doing anything for their children, and we somehow can't see that because we have dehumanized them. They're not actually human anymore. So we can't even see that we have similar emotional motivations. Yeah. I'm happy to answer any other questions or comments, or I don't know. Oh, yes.
Miłosz. Yeah.
Miłosz, thank
yeah,
you.
so
I
thank
try.
you a lot
I don't want to offend you by mispronouncing your name. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Thank you a lot for the meeting today, and you've been speaking a lot about the about how Americans interact with these migrant stories, how the perception or misperception of the migrants is created in the discourse, and but you've also mentioned that there is this sense of empathy in the American people still left, and I've been wondering whether do you see any form of actually changing this discourse of getting through to people in perhaps even on an individual basis that actually works?
That's a very good question. And I will say there are times when I have zero hope. But if I let that in too much, then I won't keep doing the work that I'm doing. I will say that once I am able to have a conversation with people and show them facts, right? Not just an emotional conversation, but an actual engagement with like the material I showed you today. It does change people. I've been teaching this now for a fair amount of time, and all of my students, even those who are perhaps more conservatively leaning, understand it differently, especially once they've talked to a migrant, right? Once they've visited a detention center, which I require them to do. But it takes a process. Like one conversation isn't going to change anything. But all of them who go through the process do rediscover empathy. I think, however, right now it's going to be very difficult because the United States is so radically polarized, and we just look who we voted for. I mean, like, this is terrifying, to be completely honest about it. And I think that is going to make it even harder to change people's minds. I suspect, I don't know, I can't predict the future, but I suspect once Americans realize the actual impact of these policies, like, for example, that the cost of living is going to skyrocket, or, the promised economic benefits don't materialize, may begin to start questioning this. But, I'll just be blunt. I think that in America, we have stronger, a stronger tendency towards racism and misogyny than we actually think we do. And I think that is on full display right now. And that isn't easy to change. So I guess exposure is, so there is a way to change it. It's exposure, conversations like this. But you have to get them to have that conversation first. And I engaged with, so my brother is similar to me. He lives in Michigan, but he's a blue collar worker. Yeah. And he works with people who think that the fact that they own guns and are 200 pounds overweight, but they're going to protect the United States from Chinese invasion through Canada. Okay, this is just how they view the world. Yep. And I engaged with this person on social media, which was a mistake. basically trying to outline just some facts. Like before you make these assumptions about immigrants, here are some facts, right? And he responded, well, I see your point, but I have my opinion and you have your opinion, and you're not going to change my opinion. So when we're talking about facts as opinion, well, you're not going to change people's minds, right? Because my opinion is valid as if it were a fact. Well, that's emotional. That's not factual. Yeah. And so the first step is getting people to actually engage factually rather than emotionally, then to get them engaged emotionally by talking to people, right? And then they'll change their minds. But it's a difficult and long process. I still believe in it because I'm still doing this work, but there are days, there are days. But there's no other way really. And right now it's just going to get much harder.
If I
I'm
may
afraid.
add something, a comment to what you've said, I think the only hope is to do it at school, very
Mm.
early age. This is what
Mhm.
we observe now, and again relate to the Ukrainians and the kids that go to our schools. They simply, they speak Polish now, perfect, unlike their parents, because we
Mhm.
communicate with the parents in the classroom, things that we have to discuss, and we can see that they still struggle, but the kids, they speak perfect. And the kids in school, at least where my daughter goes, they have no problem, with
Mhm.
accepting them. Just this is a normal thing, right? And then what changes in people's minds? And they are exposed to those arguments that you talk about, that opinions, facts as opinions, and then suddenly they change. But as kids, they don't see the difference. I mean, they accept them, they play with them. It's not a
Yeah.
problem. So I guess the education,
Education
yeah.
and the youth. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's I don't fool myself that I'm going to be able to change many adults, but even college kids I can change. But after that, I'm not so sure. You start preaching to the choir after a while. But you're absolutely right. It's the kids. Unfortunately, they're not in charge, right? They should be maybe, but
And one more comment, if I may, sorry to just say so many things, but when you said that our students responded like, more accurate than your American students, I just want to say that we have this long history of visas, that we just, visas, that was actually Donald Trump, his previous administration, that let us go without visas. But that's, of course, it wasn't his decision only, but the factors that, not that many illegal people were. It's just the
right.
numbers that they do. But, we do have, at least I do have, a long list of people that I know that have been through the visa interview. And that's not nice.
No.
It's absolutely not a nice
Even if you
memory
have
that I
all
have.
the legal right to do it, right? It's still terrifying.
No,
I'm
you
terrified
have,
every time I cross the border, and I'm a citizen, and I'm still terrified.
right, yes. So, even though it was in Poland, you go to the consulate, you talk to a person who simply does not treat you as a human, I guess. So, we do have this kind of understanding of that. I think it's just been recently. I mean, we also can't get used to not having, like, we don't have to go to Warsaw anymore. But me and Eva, yes, well, as students, we always had to go to Warsaw to apply, to wait, it wasn't so easy. Now we can, we just do it online. And this is for me still like, oh my God, I'm so lucky. So, it's just a
Yeah.
frame of mind.
And I did two very quick comments to that. Most Americans don't travel out of their state, let alone out of the country. So they have no concept of this whatsoever. And most Americans can just get a passport and go pretty much anywhere that they want to go. I mean, I had to get a visa to go to China, and I've had to get a visa for like Argentina and a few other places. But most Americans don't go to those places, right? So most Americans don't have a passport. If they do, they don't need anything else for it. So they have no concept of these sorts of limitations or the challenges, which is why they ask, the first question they ask is, well, why don't people just come legally? Uh, because it's complicated and it takes 30 years and there's a lot of paperwork and there's a lot of money and you have no concept what you're talking about. So yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe just one last question.
I have all the time in the world. It's snowing outside, so I'm not going
Well, I
anywhere.
have a question for you, but I have a long one. I mean, it will require a long answer, so I'm gonna ask you, outside of this space.
Anybody?
Okay, so I'll ask about the other border because I'm working on that right now. I'm really interested in that, because there is always this juxtaposition, right? And the stereotype that the US-Mexico border is the problematic border and US-Canada border is no problems whatsoever, right? And the more you dig, the more you know that it's not so true. And you live on this border. So just really, really briefly, and I'm going to get back to you, so worry not. But if you could say something about that reality too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a much longer border than it is with Mexico. It's a less patrolled border because a lot of it is wilderness. Um, it's a generally friendly border because racially, culturally, there's a lot more similarities across those borders. Most of the border is like trees cut down and like a ditch or a little mound of earth. Um, Here in Buffalo, it's a water border. We have the river divides us. Um, but there's like 4 or 5 bridges that cross. I mean, I can cross to Canada pretty frequently and pretty easily. Um, but there are places that one can cross and there is no border. For example, before my husband was naturalized, he had a I-95 or something, a very long piece of paper.
I-94.
Or yeah, something like that, right? It was a very long
I
piece of paper.
remember it. We also had it. Yeah.
And and we were in Canada and he was legally allowed to be there. And then we crossed on a ferry and there was no border checkpoint on the other side at all. So there was no record that we had actually re-entered the United States. He freaked out about it because he thought, well, now they don't know that I've re-entered legally. Like there was literally no person to check, right? It was, it's
We
a
did the same thing in Tijuana. We are also freaking out. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's crazy, right? And the and his yeah, it's there's no way to patrol this border, drones or not. We don't even know what's happening to the drones over New Jersey. What are we going to do trying to patrol our border with drones, right? Like it's crazy. Um, and it requires international agreement and cooperations. Actually, literally where I live, you could actually swim across to the current is shallow enough that or I could take a paddle boat, a kayak across, right? People could do that easily enough. Um, the people are dying on the northern border, but they're primarily dying because they immigrate. They try to cross the border in winter, and so they're not prepared for the winter here, and so that's when they're dying. Um, People are apprehended pretty regularly here in Buffalo at the border crossings. Uh, because they're bridges, right? There's unless you're going to swim or canoe across, you can't walk across the border where we are. So I can't really speak to what it is like in the West, but it's also sparsely populated, and it's not as certain areas are not as developed as the Mexican border is in terms of legal or extra legal systems of support on both sides of the border that are not interested necessarily in helping migrants, but are interested in profit. Yeah. I mean, some like KBI, right, is interested in helping migrants, but those organizations primarily don't exist along the northern border. Some places do, here in Buffalo and on the other side in Ontario, they do, but most places are too remote for any of those things to also mean much. There's a funny anecdote. So there's an annual activity that happens near Detroit, which is also the same kind of border as here in Buffalo, where Americans get into the river and float down the river and then, on inner tubes or whatever, and then get off. And sometimes the current or the wind will blow them into Canada. They're technically illegally entering Canada because they don't have their passports with them, right? So they have to be deported back and processed back. It's a huge problem. And Americans are just so blithely unaware of their privilege that they just assume they can do whatever they want, and that includes floating illegally into Canada, right? Now, when I was a kid, I could just go into Canada, no big deal. Like we would sometimes like just take a road trip across Michigan, go into Canada just to say we've been to Canada, right? And they never checked anything. But now it's a completely different world. So, yeah.
Okay, so I'll get back to you because
Yeah, there's
I
more
have
to
something
talk
in
about
mind.
this,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. So thank you once again for the great talk, and thank you to all of you, all of the students who came over here at this late hour, who stayed with us, and to all the other participants from outside of Maria Curie University. Thanks for joining us, and I hope we'll, stay together. We'll do some things together in the future as well. And since we are almost, we are approaching the break, so I would also want to wish all of you happy holiday season, get some rest, and enjoy it with your families, on your own, however you like it. So all the best to you and all the best in the next year. Fingers crossed for next year. So thank you once again, Richard.
Especially considering who's going to become president in this country next
I
year.
know.
I need a lot of luck
I
to get
know. I know.
But thank you very much for the
Yeah.
invitation. Thank you all for your questions, and I enjoyed this, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you.